There's one more question.
Yeah.
So Josh just joined in, and I was saying, not sure if this has already been covered, which it hasn't, so it's a good question. Is reusing yeast worth the effort, and are there any risks to doing it?
Yeah. We're getting into, that's a little more advanced area, how to reuse yeasts. Yes and no. If you're going to reuse yeast to minimise hassle and problems, is if you're making 2 beers in succession, make a lighter beer first. So maybe you're making a pale ale or something, is what's considered a quote unquote standard gravity. And once that beer ferments, package it, keg it, bottle it, whatever you're going to do, and then this is where it gets a little bit of pain because you've got to sort of get all your ducks in a row. You brew another beer, that can be a bigger beer, maybe you're going to make a big barley wine or something, because you might as well take advantage of all the yeast that's sitting there in the fermenter. And all that yeast, a lot of that will still be fresh and healthy, like it hasn't gone through its complete life cycle, so they're kind of ready to kick off and ferment another batch, and there'll be plenty of those left. So just make your new beer, pour it on top, and it'll kick off like a rocket. I suspect you're probably asking more about harvesting yeast, which is where you collect some of the yeast slime from the bottom of your fermenter and save it for another date. Yes, you can absolutely do that. I recommend maintaining just as clean a practice as possible in doing that. You can capture a jar of yeast slurry, it'll last for maybe a month in the fridge, and you can probably just use that again, chuck that straight into your fresh batch of beer without too many worries. Beyond a month, you'll probably want to wake it up again using a starter. So whether it's worth it is personal preference.
Isaac's just jumped into the chat and said pretty much what I was going to suggest on that topic as well, which is basically I think, like you said, pouring the wort straight onto the yeast cake from a previous fermentation, and if you plan your beers and build up in colour, flavour and gravity. I actually try to do that every lager season if I can be organised enough. So I'll brew like a 𝗓𝐿 or a Pils to start with, move up into like maybe a 𝗓𝗏𝗡𝗏 or a Vienna, and then into like a Bock or something like that. So I'm building up in intensity, in flavours and in gravity as I go. And that way you get really strong, healthy ferments in each consecutive lager without having to do like a massive 5-litre starter to hit a big high gravity lager fermentation. But in terms of harvesting, rinsing yeast, all those sorts of things, Isaac's comment is basically saying that he overbuilds starters to save the yeast. That can be easier, but you need to ramp up more from the small rinsed samples you have. And I think if you're wanting to get the most out of a pack of yeast, I know one of our customers moved to Canada, rural Canada, so like middle of nowhere, like fighting off the polar bears, decent drive into town kind of Canada.
Wow.
And what they would do is, and they might be watching, I don't know, possibly, but they were saying they would purchase the yeast, split it, and do starters on the split packs, and then have like a bunch, so like from one pack of yeast, they'd have like a bunch of small jars that they'd collected, and then they would build those up with a series of starters each time they needed to use it, because it wasn't reasonable to go to the homebrew shop sort of whenever they wanted to brew.
Sure.
So that's a cool way to do it as well, and then that way you know that you've got less chances of having infected your yeast at that point, and you can basically pull out your little jar when you need it, chuck it in a starter, build it up as much as you think you're going to need to, and based on how long it's been in there as well, and that way you can sort of get a bit of distance out of your yeast, if that's what you're sort of needing to do. You sort of weigh up money versus time versus effort.
Absolutely.
And also variety. If all your beers are being brewed with the one strain of yeast and you don't mind putting in the extra time and effort to do that, then that's obviously something you can do. But I like to brew lots of different types of beers and have like a range. So I've got like 4 taps at home. Usually I've got a cider. I've got a 5th tap, which is just my soda water keg. And I'll have a cider on tap 4. So that's sort of three different beers that I have on at any given time, and I like to keep variety there. So quite often I'll be using quite different yeasts across those different beers as I'm brewing, and having a fridge full of
I'm using a tap.
Having a fridge full of all the same yeast isn't really useful to me personally, but everybody's different, and depending on what you're brewing and things like that, it can be a good thing to do.
So what do you think? Is reusing yeast worth it? Maybe you've got some of your own tips and tricks you'd like to share, or maybe you just think it's all a big fat waste of time. In any case, we'd all love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below.